If history has taught us anything, it's that ability lock is one of the most broken things you can do in the Pokemon TCG. The latest incarnation comes in the form of Ting-Lu EX from the new Paldea Evolved expansion. Ting-Lu is a 240 hit point behemoth of a basic and has the Earthen Curse ability, which will be the entire build around for this deck. When Ting-Lu EX is in the active position, your opponent's Pokemon with damage counters on them have no abilities. Unfortunately, this does exclude EX Pokemon, but the format is currently littered with powerful abilities, and Ting-Lu is here to spoil the party and force the opponent to play at our tempo instead. Ting-Lu's attack, Land Scoop, is pretty solid. 150 damage is enough to clear out the majority of single prizes in one hit, and we can 2-hit KO most multi-prize Pokemon. We also get to place 2 counters onto one of our opponent's benched Pokemon. Ideally, this can be used to shut off the ability of that Pokemon in the process, or can simply be used to put other Pokemon in range of KOs for later. One of the biggest things holding back Ting-Lu EX is that its attack cost is quite steep, so we're going to need some help powering it up. Koraidon EX is the obvious choice, with its Dino Cry ability. We may attach up to 2 basic fighting energy from our discard pile to our basic fighting Pokemon in any way that we like, ending our turn. It's the go-to option turn 1 to get some extra energy onto the board, and hopefully allows Ting-Lu to start swinging from our second turn to begin putting on the pressure. We also gain the option of Koraidon EX's Wild Impact attack, and this is worth noting as a secondary attacking option because the deck naturally has quite a low damage output, whereas this Koraidon gives us the option to at least 1-hit KO basic EXs and V Pokemon. Seeing as though Dino Cry is now the most important thing about this deck list, we're going to require a number of discarding options. Professor's research naturally comes to mind, as does the new Squawkabilly EX. Squawkabilly's show-off ability gives the deck the early game push that it needs to get set up, and can pitch fighting energy along the way. Radiant Greninja is normally the first on the scene when you're looking to fill the discard pile of energy, but in this case we're going to instead prioritise Radiant Alakazam in this list. Painful Spoons from Alakazam can allow us to make the most out of our mediocre damage output, and can assist in ensuring our opponent's board is locked down. These spoons will also prove integral when playing against the likes of Mew and Lugia, where thanks to resistance we often fall short of 2-hit KOs, but with the help of Alakazam, we can get right back into range. Speaking of spreading damage counters, we're going to play a couple copies of Hawlucha. Its flying entry ability is a means of instantly tagging 2 Pokemon on the opponent's bench to deny their abilities. Gapejaw Bog is the obvious stadium inclusion that I've seen time and time again from Japanese deck lists, but I'm going to go against the grain here with the inclusion of 2 copies of PokeStop for added early game dig and discard synergy. It's true that sometimes our opponent could be bailed out by this stadium, but if we're shutting down Pokemon effectively, giving the opponent access to Ball Search shouldn't be too much of an issue. And at the end of the day, we really want a deeper dig into our deck, because it's all about discarding fighting energy. I can't overstate how important Dino Cry is for this deck list. It's absolutely essential, so I'm never going to say no to improving our odds. With PokeStop now added into the list, we have even more incentive to load up on item cards. VIP Pass once again stands out here as the go-to choice for Pokemon search, as we naturally want Koraidon EX early, and will often look to Squawkabilly as our discard option. At the same time, we often require a backup Ting-Lu developed to play around Escape Rope and to give us a perfect target for our Gutsy Pickaxe. That's right, we are going to be playing maximum copies of the Gutsy Pick. It's not necessarily a reliable card, but anytime we do hit energy, it's a massive bonus for us, and this still adds to our overall goal of cycling through the deck. Ultra Ball adds to our search counts and gives us even more discard synergy, and most importantly, it's the way we find our Hawlucha, because this Pokemon has to be in hand in order to get the flying entry effect. Speaking of discard, we are going to keep on theme and have trekking shoes in the deck. Once again, I can't stress enough just how important it is. We always want to bin fighting energy in the opening stages and just get our ideal board state rolling from the first turn of the game, because we are setting our stall out early. Next, we're going to add some switch carts and an escape rope, seeing as though we have some very chunky Pokemon in this deck list, and we always want Ting-Lu to end up in the active position. For some slightly more reliable energy retention than Gutsy Pickaxe, we are going to add a copy of Exp.Share, but the main tool I'm excited about is Charm of Courage, a new tool from Paldea Evolved, which pushes Ting-Lu EX's already impressive 240 hit points up to 290. Hopefully this buff gives us more time to stick around on board, as our damage output leaves a lot to be desired, and we can always use that extra turn to get more manual attachments onto our next Ting-Lu. Because the name of the game is Disruption in this deck, we're going to include maximum copies of Judge to reduce the opponent's hand size in the early game, as we want to give our opponent as few options as possible whilst we stifle their draw from ability-based Pokemon. It does feel strange to give Judge the nod over the new Iono supporter, but games are often won and lost in the opening few turns for this deck, based on how hard we can make life for our opponent, so Judge does seem to be the better fit. Finally, we'll add in a couple of Boss's Orders. We are a 2-hit KO deck after all, so bringing stuff back after being poked is pretty important. Now let's take a look at the starting point list. I've pretty much gone full theme deck with this one, maximum copies of our main attacker, and it's pretty much our only attacker. Then we have a massive 14 energy count to improve our all-round odds of finding them, discarding them for Koraidon, attaching every single turn of the game, and on those rare occasions where we can hit off Gutsy Pickaxe. We're then playing a huge number of item cards to try and get some cycle in the opening stages, and it's a nod to the PokeStop stadium we've chosen to adopt. I believe I've succeeded in making the list capable of being a pretty consistent irritation for the format. PokeStop is probably the most contentious inclusion in my deck list, but there's actually a number of stadium cards which all have merits here. I've already mentioned Gapejaw Bog as a means of getting extra damage counters on the opponent's Pokemon, but Primordial Altar could be used to give ourselves some information before using Gutsy Pickaxe, and adds to our discard synergy if need be. We could also try Lake Acuity for extra tanking potential, and there's even the options of the likes of Temple of Sinnoh and Dynatree Hill, which could both be quite handy against Lugia matchup, one of your most difficult ones. Dynatree Hill could deny the use of Radiant Serena, which is Lugia's main way of unlocking their Archeops, and Temple of Sinnoh could make it more difficult for the opponent to launch attacks, especially from their higher damage output threats like Tyranitar. Another way to improve that matchup could be Aerodactyl V-Star. Going first and simply denying the use of Summoning Star is more than likely the most effective strategy this deck has available. Grant's an interesting supporter card which has crossed my mind. We have so much discard synergy, and we're happy to leave Grant in the discard pile, knowing that we could use it at any time alongside some Radiant Alakazam gymnastics to get some knockouts. But let's look more closely at Ting-Lu's matchups, and how our opponent will be attempting to get around our lock. Talking about matchups is always a strange one with Ting-Lu, seeing as though we're always trying to just simply stop the opponent from playing, and in this case we're going to be targeting the draw power with Hawlucha, by denying Radiant Greninja and Curlier, alongside as many Judge as possible. We're pretty terrified of Cresselia, as that can undo a lot of our work, so trying to rack 3 counters on lots of Pokemon can be quite important to make sure the opponent isn't continuing to draw cards. And same thing for Champs Festival here. I don't expect it to be hugely popular, but it's another headache that we have to try and play around. Even though Gardevoir EX has that fighting resistance, they're naturally embracing and putting damage counters onto a number of their Pokemon, so we still can get in the mix with our Alakazam, and are often still making 2-hit KOs onto this Pokemon, so that's at least something going for us. The likes of Judge are huge, and of course trying to look towards our Charm of Courage to try and keep out of range for as long as possible. Lugia V-Star is another really tricky one. This Pokemon also has that fighting resistance, which is very hard for us to deal with, especially because they also play Radiant Serena. Radiant Serena is really annoying because it unlocks their Archeops, so having to use our second Hawlucha on the Serena, or any of our other damage counter movers like Alakazam, will then turn off the Radiant Serena, but in doing so, we're losing so much damage and give the opponent sometimes extra turns of the Primal Turbo, which is a real frustration. I think, honestly, if you want to have a favourable matchup, you probably need to play the Aerodactyl V-Star, because right now it's a bit of a slog. Lost Zone decks are actually some of our better matchups. We can really disrupt their early game by denying their use of Comfey and Radiant Greninja, and of course we're a really chunky 2-prize Pokemon that's already naturally playing a high switch card count and playing a high count of Judge. These are all things that Lost Box players don't want to see, and our 150 damage is enough to carve through all of their Pokemon. Be aware that our own use of PokeStop sometimes can be detrimental, because the opponent is always thirsty for their switch cards. Chien-Pao is another archetype where we have very easy choices here. Trying to deny their use of Baxcalibur essentially makes Chien-Pao EX useless, and it doesn't really matter that they can Trembling Cold all these energy into the hand if they can't instantly put them into play. I think you do have to be a little bit cautious of Switch Cart being a tech inclusion in Chien-Pao to unlock some of their Pokemon before evolving into Baxcalibur, for example. And also be wary that Palkia is already quite a low maintenance Pokemon, so that's often something you're going to have to go through in this matchup. Against Mew, it's pretty obvious that we're targeting the Genesect to deny the draw power, but the opponent can be playing a Fusion Strike build and commit energies onto, one Genesect at a time to unlock them as they go. But they could also be teching in Crystal Cave, which is a huge heal, which is something you would hate to see. For our tech inclusions, we could try Spiritomb. This is a Pokemon we can search out proactively, even if the opponent has gone first, which is giving us an easy way of locking out the Genesects from as early as turn 1, rather than having to wait for the opponent to get the Genesects in play for us to flying entry onto them. And the other alternative is simply slapping that Drapion and see how it sticks. I feel like the Spiritomb is probably the better choice here, though. Arceus is looking like a pretty decent one for us. It's of course a matchup where we are hitting for weakness, at least for a couple of Pokemon, and we can even try and deny that Starbirth altogether with Flying Entry, and also deny the Squovit the Barrel Engine. I think it's really only an issue matchup if the opponent is choosing to play the likes of Flying Pikachu and Alolan Vulpix, and if these tech Pokemon are becoming popular, increasing our counts of Escape Rope, and even possibly adding in a Serena in addition to our 2 Boss's Orders would be the best idea here. I hope you enjoyed today's spotlight of Ting-Lu EX. I'm always terrified of cards like these being printed, because whenever you play with or against a strategy like this, you know that the game will devolve into a real scrap. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.